My husband, Gerald, had a saying he repeated every time life handed us something we didn't expect. He'd press his lips together, look out toward the tree line past our backyard, and say, "Ruth, the ground always knows more than the people standing on it." I never fully understood what he meant until the morning after his funeral. When my daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table in the house I had lived in for 31 years and told me it was no longer mine. I am 73 years old. I taught third grade for 26 of those years at Clover Hill Elementary in Billings, Montana. I know how to read a room. I know when a child is lying, when a parent is hiding something, when the smile on someone's face does not reach their eyes. So when my daughter, Carolyn, my firstborn, sat down with her husband Derek beside her like a wall she'd built overnight, I already felt it coming before she opened her mouth. Gerald had been gone 4 days. "Mom," she said, folding her hands on the table the way she used to do in school when she'd practiced her argument. "Derek and I have been talking about the estate." I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. "All right. The house, the property, it makes more sense for us to take it over. We have the kids. We have the space needs. You'd rattle around here alone." She paused. "Dad left everything jointly structured, and we've spoken with an attorney. Legally, it transitions to us." I looked at Derek. He looked at the table. "And where would I go?" I asked. Carolyn glanced at Derek, then back at me. "Dad had that old property up near Glacier. The cabin. I had not thought about that cabin in years. Gerald had inherited it from his uncle, a man named Howard who'd lived alone most of his life and died without children. The cabin sat on about 40 acres somewhere north of Whitefish, a place I had visited exactly twice in our marriage. Once in 1997, when Gerald wanted to assess the condition of the roof, and once in 2003 when we'd tried to make a weekend of it and turned around after a raccoon got inside the screened porch. It had no updated plumbing. The heating was a wood stove. The nearest town was 18 miles of gravel road. "You're sending me to Howard's cabin," I said. "It's yours. Fully." Dad made sure of that. Carolyn's voice softened in that way that isn't actually soft. "It's peaceful up there. You could rest." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, Gerald's bird feeders swayed in the April wind, the same feeders he'd filled every Saturday morning for 20 years. "I'll need a few days to pack," I said. She exhaled. "Of course. Take your time." I didn't take my time. I packed what I needed in 2 days, loaded my Subaru, and drove north. Not because I believed she had any legal ground to stand on. I didn't. Not yet. I hadn't spoken to anyone. But I was 73 years old and I had just buried my husband, and I did not have the fight in me that week. What I had was the need to be somewhere quiet. And whatever Howard's cabin was, it was quiet. The drive took nearly 4 hours. The last stretch of gravel road rattled everything in my car loose. By the time the cabin came into view through the pines, the sun was already dropping behind the ridge. It was smaller than I remembered. The porch sagged on one side. Rust had eaten through the gutters. But the structure itself was solid. The logs thick. And when I pushed the door open, the smell that came out, pine, resin, and old wood, and something like cold iron, was not unpleasant. It was the smell of something that had been waiting. I set my bags down. I stood in the center of the main room and looked around. There was a wood stove, a cot in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, one of them split along the back, a shelf of old paperback novels with sun-bleached spines, and along the far wall, beneath a window that looked out toward a stand of larch, a long wooden chest, the kind with iron hardware, the kind my grandmother would have called a hope chest pushed against the baseboard as if it had always been part of the wall itself. I noticed it but didn't open it that night. I was exhausted. I made a fire in the wood stove, ate crackers and peanut butter from my cooler, and lay down on the cot with my coat over me. I dreamed about Gerald standing in a field, pointing at the ground. In the morning, I woke to birdsong so thick it felt like weather. I lay still for a few minutes listening to it. Then I got up, put water on the small propane burner I'd brought, and while my coffee heated, I walked to the wooden chest and lifted the lid. It didn't stick. The hinges moved smoothly, as if someone had oiled them recently, or as if they'd been built well enough that time itself hadn't bothered them. Inside, folded neatly beneath a wool blanket and a pair of leather work gloves, was a wooden tray. And beneath the tray, documents. Not just any documents. There were survey maps, hand-drawn, professional, dated across different decades. A file folder of correspondence between Gerald and someone named Paul Whitmore, a name I didn't recognize. Letters going back 15 years. 2 sealed envelopes, both addressed to me in Gerald's handwriting. One labeled open first, one labeled open when you're ready. My hands were not entirely steady when I picked up the first envelope. Gerald's letter was 4 pages. Written in his deliberate engineer's print, the letters all the same height. He started with an apology. Not for sending me to the cabin, he explained, that was intentional, but for not telling me sooner. He had been trying to protect me from a complicated situation, he wrote, one that had taken him years to understand himself. His Uncle Howard, it turned out, had not been simply an eccentric old man who'd lived alone. Howard had spent 30 years quietly documenting something about the land around the cabin, specifically, about what was beneath it. Gerald had found Howard's notebooks after the funeral, had spent the better part of a decade corresponding with geologists and mining consultants, quietly and privately, not wanting to raise anyone's expectations until he was certain. By the time Paul Whitmore, a licensed geologist out of Missoula, had completed a full subsurface survey, Gerald was already sick. He'd been diagnosed 8 months before, he told me. He had not wanted me to carry the weight of both things at once. The land beneath those 40 acres contained a significant deposit of copper and silver ore. Paul Whitmore's survey, included in the folder, estimated the deposit's value at somewhere between $4 and $7 million at current extraction rates. Gerald had quietly transferred full title of the property, the cabin and all 40 acres, into a trust in my name alone. He had done it 18 months before he died. Before Carolyn and Derek had known he was sick, before any of the estate conversations had begun. The trust was ironclad, he wrote. He'd had 3 attorneys review it. He listed their names and phone numbers. Carolyn doesn't know about any of this, he wrote near the end. I love our daughter, but I know what Derek is. I've seen what he does to money. I am leaving you the cabin because it is the only thing I am certain they cannot reach. Please trust me on this, Ruth. The ground knows more than the people standing on it. I set the letter down on the wooden tray. I sat in the chair that wasn't split and looked out the window at the larch trees for a long time. Then I picked up the folder with Paul Whitmore's survey and read every page. I spent my first full week at the cabin doing practical things. I swept it out. I found a split log around the back that someone had once begun cutting into firewood, and I finished the job. I identified the 2 windows that leaked and stuffed them with old towels until I could get proper weather stripping. I drove into Whitefish twice, once for groceries, once to find a notary and make copies of every document in that chest, which I mailed to my sister in Spokane for safekeeping. I also called the first attorney on Gerald's list, a woman named Patricia Holt in Billings. I did not tell Carolyn. Patricia was direct in the way I find useful. She told me the trust was solid. She'd seen Gerald's filing herself. She said, since one of the other attorneys on his list had looped her in during the drafting process. She told me Carolyn had no legal claim to the cabin or the land. She also told me that what Carolyn had done representing to me that the estate transitioned to her under some joint structure was, at minimum, a misrepresentation, and possibly more than that depending on what had actually been filed. Has anyone contacted you on behalf of the estate? Patricia asked. My daughter. And a man she referred to as the family attorney. Who is he? I gave her the name. There was a pause. Mrs. Calloway, Patricia said. I want you to be careful about what you sign in the coming weeks. Don't sign anything without sending it to me first. Can you do that? I said yes. And one more thing, she said. Don't tell anyone what you found in that cabin, not yet. The call came on a Thursday evening. 3 weeks after I'd arrived at the cabin. My phone showed an unfamiliar number with a Missoula area code. When I answered, the voice on the other end was a man's careful, professional, the kind of careful that has been practiced. Mrs. Calloway? My name is Nathan Greaves. I represent Broadridge Land Holdings. I believe we may have some mutual interests regarding a piece of property in Flathead County. I walked to the window and looked out. The sun was still up, just barely, throwing long shadows through the larch. Is that so? I said. We've been aware of the Calloway parcel for some time, he said. I understand you've recently come into ownership. We'd be very interested in making you an offer. Something fair, given the remote nature of the land. I asked what fair looked like. He named a number, $240,000. I thanked him for calling and told him I'd need some time to think. After I hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time in the cold. $240,000. For land worth potentially $7 million. Someone had told Nathan Greaves about this property. Someone who knew I had come here. Someone who wanted me to take the first offer put in front of me and leave. The next morning, I drove into Whitefish and used the library's internet to look up Broadridge Land Holdings. The company had been incorporated 14 months ago. Its registered agent was a law firm in Missoula. One of the firm's partners was listed as a consultant for a mineral extraction company headquartered in Calgary. I wrote everything down. I drove back to the cabin. That night, headlights swept across the interior wall through the gap in the curtains. I had turned my lamp off an hour before habit, not fear. So I was sitting in the dark reading by the wood stove light when the lights moved across the room. A vehicle had come up the gravel road, which ended at my door. There was nowhere else to go. The engine cut. I heard a door close. Footsteps on gravel. Then a knock. I wrapped my cardigan around me and went to the door. I did not open it. Who is it? I asked. A pause. Mrs. Calloway? My name is Tom Whitmore. Paul Whitmore's son. I worked with your husband. I opened the door. He was younger than I expected, early 40s, wearing a Carhartt jacket, holding a knit cap in both hands. He had the look of someone who'd driven a long way and hadn't decided yet whether he'd done the right thing by coming. I'm sorry for showing up like this, he said. I tried to call. I couldn't get through. I had bad reception at the cabin. I stepped back and let him in. Tom Whitmore told me that his father Paul had died the previous year, something Gerald had not mentioned in his letter, possibly because he hadn't known. After Paul's death, Tom had found his father's file on the Calloway survey. Last month, he'd been contacted by a man named Nathan Greaves, asking questions about the subsurface work his father had done on private land in Flathead County. Tom hadn't told Greaves anything, but it had concerned him enough to find me. Greaves works for people who make a habit of acquiring mineral rights from landowners who don't know what they have, Tom said. My father ran into them twice before. Once in Nevada, once in Idaho. Both times the landowner sold for a fraction of value. Someone told him about this land. I said, someone who knew I was here. Tom looked at his hands. Your daughter called my father's old office number 2 weeks ago. The forwarding goes to my phone now. I set my coffee mug down. What did she say? I asked. She said she was trying to locate documents related to a family property in Flathead County. She said she was the owner. He looked up at me. I didn't tell her anything, but I think whoever she's working with already knew about the survey. I thought about Derek. About the way he'd looked at the table that morning in my kitchen. About the 18 months Gerald had spent quietly, carefully, building a legal wall around this land. About Nathan Greaves calling me 4 days after I'd spoken to no one. Tom, I said, how much is the deposit actually worth? Your father's estimate covered a range. He was quiet for a moment. At current silver prices, with copper trending the way it's been, conservative estimate is closer to $6 million. Could push toward 8 if the seam runs further north than Dad mapped. I nodded. I got up and put more wood in the stove. What would you need? I asked. To run a new survey, a proper one, with current equipment. He blinked. I could do that. $2 maybe 3 weeks. I'll pay you for your time, I said, and when it's done, I want a documented, certified report. Something that can stand up in court. Patricia Holt came to Whitefish herself the following week. We met at a diner on Central Avenue and sat in a corner booth for 2 hours while I showed her everything I had: the original survey, Gerald's letters, the documents from the chest, my notes on Broadridge land holdings, and Nathan Greaves. She took photographs of everything on her phone and didn't say much until I was done. "Here's what I see," she said, setting down her coffee cup. "Broadridge has been in contact with your daughter or Derek, who then pointed them toward this land. That creates a potential conspiracy to commit fraud, depending on what representations were made and to whom. The misrepresentation about the estate structure that pushed you out of the Billings house is a separate matter but connected." "What are the charges?" I asked. Because I had learned from the comment on the video I'd never seen. I had learned from a lifetime of watching people skip over the consequence when they described the crime. "If we can demonstrate Carolyn and Derek knew about the mineral deposit and were actively working to steer the sale to Broadridge at below market value, conspiracy to commit fraud, potentially elder financial abuse under Montana statute, that carries real penalties." She paused. "The Billings house, depending on what was filed and how, could be deed fraud. That's a felony. And Greaves? Wire fraud, potentially, if he was coordinating with them across state lines." I sat back. "Patricia," I said, "I don't want to destroy my daughter." She looked at me carefully. "I know, but I want you to understand that protecting yourself and holding people accountable aren't the same thing as destroying someone. Carolyn made choices. Derek made choices. You didn't make those choices for them." I thought about Gerald standing in a field, pointing at the ground. The ground knows more than the people standing on it. "What do we do?" I asked. She folded her hands on the table. "We set a stage. Patricia arranged it over the following 3 weeks. Tom completed his new survey, a thorough one, documented and certified, that placed the deposit's value at a confirmed minimum of $5.8 million. Patricia filed the trust documentation with the county, establishing my ownership publicly and on record. Then she had me call Nathan Greaves back. I told him I had reconsidered. I told him I was ready to discuss the sale. I said I'd like to meet him in person at the property, to walk the land before signing anything. He agreed without hesitation. What Nathan Greaves did not know was that Patricia had already been in contact with the Flathead County Sheriff's Office and the Montana Department of Justice. What he did not know was that the conversation I had with him on the phone, in which he confirmed the existence of previous communications with the family, confirmed that Broadridge understood the full scope of the land's value, and confirmed the intention to acquire the mineral rights at significantly below assessed worth had been recorded, legally, with Patricia on the line as a witness. He drove up in a leased SUV. He was well-dressed, younger than his voice. He shook my hand and smiled and looked around at the cabin and the trees, with the expression of a man who couldn't believe his luck. He did not make it to the table where I'd set out coffee. 2 vehicles from the county sheriff followed him up the gravel road at the appointed time. A 3rd vehicle behind those carried an investigator from the State Department of Justice. Nathan Greaves was charged that afternoon with wire fraud and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of an at-risk adult. He was taken from my property in handcuffs, which I watched from the porch with my coffee mug in both hands. The investigation that followed moved quickly once Greaves began cooperating. The communications between Derek and Broadridge went back 11 months before Gerald had even died. In the last weeks, when Derek had apparently already begun calculating what he might access, Carolyn's involvement was harder to establish. Her attorney argued she hadn't understood the full scope of what Derek was doing. The investigators were less generous than her attorney. In the end, Derek was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation and received 4 years supervised probation, a substantial fine, and was ordered to return legal possession of the Billings house to me, which Patricia handled through a civil filing that cost Derek's family considerably more in attorney's fees than a simple return would have. Carolyn was charged separately. She cooperated from the beginning, which reduced her exposure significantly. She did not go to prison. She received 2 years probation and was required to complete financial ethics counseling, which I understand from people who know more about these things than I do is not as meaningless as it sounds. I didn't speak to Carolyn for 6 months after the charges were filed. When she called the first time, I let it go to voicemail. When she called the second time, 3 weeks later, I listened to the message 4 times before I decided what to do. She was crying in it. She said she was sorry. She said Derek had pushed her into things she hadn't understood until it was too late, which may have been true, and may not have been true, and which is the kind of thing a mother turns over and over in her hands for a long time. I called her back the 3rd week of November. We talked for an hour and a half. I'm not going to tell you what we said. Some things stay between a mother and a daughter. The following spring, I signed a mineral rights lease with a legitimate extraction company out of Helena, a company with a 20-year record and a negotiated rate that Patricia reviewed line by line. The initial payment alone was enough to make me sit down on the porch steps when Tom Whitmore called to tell me long-term royalties would follow for the duration of the extraction, which the geologist estimated at 30 to 40 years. I moved back to Billings. I kept the cabin. Not because I had to. Not because it made practical sense for a 73-year-old woman to maintain a property 18 miles from town on a gravel road, but because on the mornings when I drove up there and sat on that sagging porch with my coffee and watched the larch trees move in the wind, I felt something I don't have a better word for than held. Like the land itself knew I was there and was not surprised to see me. I hired a contractor to fix the porch. I replaced the gutters. I had Tom Whitmore's wife, who turned out to be an architect, design a small addition, nothing grand, just a proper bathroom and a room where I could put a real bed. I kept the wooden chest exactly where Gerald had left it, beneath the window that looks toward the trees. Some evenings I open the second letter, the one labeled "Open when you're ready," and read it again. Gerald writes about the morning he first walked this land with Howard, when he was 19 years old and didn't know what he was looking at. He writes about what it felt like to come back 30 years later with Paul Whitmore's equipment and finally understand. He writes about the weight of a secret held for someone you love. He writes about trust, not the legal document, but the other kind. I always believed you were stronger than you knew you were, he writes, near the end. I just needed to give you the place to find out. The morning after I read that letter for the first time, I stood on the porch and watched the sun come across the ridge and light up the tops of the larch trees and thought about all the things that live beneath the surface of the world. The ores and the aquifers and the roots and the buried things and how they hold their position quietly, without announcement, for as long as it takes. Patience is not a passive thing. I understand that now in a way I didn't at the beginning of all this. It is not waiting. It is continuing. It is standing on a piece of ground and trusting that the ground knows something. Gerald knew that. He spent his whole life knowing it. I'm learning,